Hi, I'm Bob Ethington.
And I'm Nick Nicholas.
And this is From Akron and Beyond. I was thinking the other day, Nick, that you and we spend quite a lot of time with Brad Savage.
Yeah.
A lot of people out there who listen to the show might know that he is our producer. He's the guy who edits the show, puts it all together. He's the magic behind me and Nick.
Wouldn't be a show without him.
That is very true. And occasionally we let him mutter a couple of remarks.
Or a half hour nonstop. What was that? Vaughn Monroe.
Vaughn Monroe, yes, exactly. But anyway, it occurred to me that actually Brad is a well-known quantity to listeners of the Summit because he's one of the main voices on the station. But how much do you really know about Brad Savage?
He's more Akron than us who were born and raised here, you know? The real Akronite.
So in other words, hey, Brad, how you doing?
Hey, guys. Thank you for asking me to be on the show, because normally I'm over here kind of running the controls, making sure the voice levels sound good. But this is your show, and I didn't put these guys up to it. I didn't slip either of these guys $50 to give me an episode. Nothing like that.
We'll negotiate later.
Yeah. Are we going to talk about your adventures when you were working for the carnival?
That's right. Yes.
That
was just a joke.
Caught a freight train. Yeah. Okay. Well, so in all seriousness, though, I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of hear a lot about, or learn some, I should say, about Brad's background, and his taste in music is so wide that I want to get into that with him as well. But
you know, the one question you always start out asking people, Bob, is what music was in their house? You
yes,
know,
I was about to do that, Nick.
Yeah, well, I beat you to it.
So, Brad, what music was in your house?
Well, yeah. So from early childhood, I remember a fascination with radio and listening to the radio, and also my father, as a record collector, was always into LPs and like that. You know, and I don't know. I've always had kind of a photographic memory when it comes to songs and artists and who sings this one and like what was the prior band they were in before that and things like that. And from a very young age, I was kind of fascinated. But anyway, my dad was into a lot of, so I'm born in 1977.
And I was going to ask, so where is this house?
So this is Minnesota. I'm growing up in Twin Cities area. Okay. And my parents were lifelong Minnesotans until they couldn't take the winters anymore. Yeah. And in the early 2000s, they actually moved to Florida. They live there today. Okay. In Melbourne, Florida, kind of near like NASA Kennedy Space Center in that area. Okay. And it was basically entirely weather-based that they ended up moving there. But my dad has been a huge influence on me, and, just listening to, the more common things like the Rolling Stones and whatever from a young age. But I also remember Dad having some early Police singles or Devo singles or really? And I used to go, I remember being very young going to the record stores with him, and very proud and happy childhood memories. Maybe that's part of why I became such an obsessive collector as well. Yeah. But yeah, so I think a lot of it really kind of started with just current music of the day when I'm in my, 5 years old or 8 years old or whatever, and then getting into top 40 radio and listening to the pop hits of the day in that 80s era. So
now, was your dad or your mom, were they musicians at all?
No, not really. Just always kind of interested in music. And also my dad has always been a very avid sports card collector and like vintage sports memorabilia and things like that.
You'd go to card shows with him?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yep. And we've accumulated quite a nice collection of, vintage sports cards and memorabilia and things through the years. And I I'm just now starting to realize that is where my obsessive collecting in many different genres of collectibles comes from. Just growing up around it. So.
I think I was that way too. I remember even before I got into music, really, I collected, there were James Bond cards.
Oh, sure.
Cards, which were really cool. I wish I still had those because those were cool. And Beatles cards and stuff. And baseball cards.
In some ways, the non-sport collectibles and the types of things that might show up, that's if you go to a Comic Con or something like that, people, there's a great deal of interest in those.
I wish.
Space race car, outer space type cards and things or UFO type cards, things like that.
I had monster cards.
Yes.
I wish I would have kept those, for all the horror movies.
Yep. Right. Amazing.
I always had a coin collection. I still do, and it was just collecting is amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
It's just a trait. You either have it or you don't.
Right.
And people either understand you or they don't. Because
a couple of weeks ago, I went to one of the Emilio's Party Center to sell some old trains that we found in our house, old Lionel.
Yeah.
And that place, it was like Woodstock. I can't believe how many people there were there, and they were all buying stuff.
Yeah. Whether it's trains or
coins, even
coins. And I took my kids. My youngest son is kind of interested in rocks, so we went to a lapidary show, and that was packed. And then there's comic book shows. And only recently, I've actually started being a used records and CD dealer, setting up at some of the shows.
Oh, do you sell?
Yeah. Well, I've only done it twice as of right now, but I love it because, my wife has been after me. You've got to do something with all of this stuff, or it's going to the dump, she says. I think Bob can relate to that, too.
Yes, I've had this same conversation.
Yes.
I got a dusty old pile of vinyl records sitting on my floor.
So, okay, let's get even a little more specific or personal to you. Now, do you remember you're listening to the radio. Do you remember the first record you bought?
Well, I think so. And this was one of the trips when we were growing up in the Twin Cities area, and my dad had some of the cool record stores that he'd take me to on days off from work or whatever. And there were two records in particular that I bought because they looked neat, and I didn't know who these artists were, but one was Kraftwerk Pocket Calculator on a lime green colored vinyl 7-inch. And I had a little Mickey Mouse record player, and I scratched the heck out of it and wrote on it in marker, but I still have it's at my parents' house. I still own it to this day.
So all the thousands of records you have at your house, you still have a collection at your parents' house?
There's some that just kind of ended up there. It's a little ridiculous. And now it's too expensive to ship it back, So so that there was that Kraftwerk, and then there was a British single of Peter Gabriel's song DIY on a 7-inch, but the British 7-inches don't have the hole in the middle. They leave the the plastic or the vinyl or whatever just has the small hole like an LP. So that's what caught my eye about that at a young age, because this is different than all the other ones. And and luckily those are songs I ended up knowing from a very young age and really liking. Yeah. So But those two in particular are some of my earliest memories.
So you're almost born to collect.
Yeah, totally. And I had some of those Disneyland tell a story records, the storybooks that had a tone when you were supposed to read along and change the page. Some of those too.
I was telling Bob I had a Easter record with a Jimmy Durante song on it when I was a kid.
Yep.
You said it was Easter.
Yankee Doodle Bunny.
Yankee Doodle Bunny.
Nick, do you remember your first record you ever bought?
Yeah, it really was the Beatles, the first one that was released here in the States.
Their first album?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a funny thing. My first record I ever bought was the first Steppenwolf album.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, with Born to Be Wild.
Yes.
I had that too.
Yeah. And I used to play it. My parents had this big console stereo in the living room, and that's where I'd have to play it. But I had to be real careful because there were a couple songs. The song "The Pusher" is on there.
It has a lot of
it has the
naughty words.
Yes,
yep.
and so I always had to be careful to turn that down.
Yep.
And then the other one that I always remember was they did a cover of the old blues song "Hoochie Coochie Man." And I remember, and I didn't think anything of it, and I remember because I was just a little kid really when I bought it. And I remember my mom came walking by, and she goes. She was from North Carolina. And she goes, "Hoochie Coochie. I don't know what that means, but I know what it meant when I was a young girl."
Oh, no. I'm actually...
Suddenly I learned what Hoochie Coochie was.
Yeah. I'm proud of the second record I bought. I bought Question Mark and the Mysterians LP on Cameo Parkway.
Very cool.
Still have that.
That's a cool one. Yeah, yeah. But, okay, so... Obviously, you have a love affair, Brad, with the radio.
Yep.
So how do you view that? Because I think back to me, I always think back and listen to AM radio. You could go to certain stores and they'd have the sheets with the top 40.
Yeah, right.
I'd get those every week and look at the list and stuff. Then there was kind of this shift to FM radio, but this is all predating your time.
Yeah,
so,
I think, well, I just remember being interested in it from a very young age. And I can trace back a certain memory where in Minnesota, KQRS was like the heritage rock station, like what WMMS is here, over 50 years playing album rock format. And one time... I remember I was probably 5 or 6, and my dad called in and won a contest. He won an album. He was caller 10 or whatever. And I just remember he was excited. I was in the house. He was on the phone. And then minutes later, that conversation aired over the radio station. They had recorded it and then played him back as the winner.
Right.
And, so I think that may be like the light bulb moment where I was like, because I kind of pictured the Jetsons, with radio consoles floating in space at their studio and something out of this world, because that just kind of blew my young mind, and so I think that might be a big part of the influence. And then I always was like,
it was sort of like a Wizard of Oz curtain getting drawn, right? Like all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, that's magic, but I heard my dad on the phone.
And now it's on the radio.
That's cool, yeah.
Really cool.
And I also, I'm an only child, and so I think I spent a lot of time just listening to the radio and the music and really getting to know the characters that presented the songs.
Same here.
That's why I wanted to do that. And it's not like I didn't like TV or cartoons or
hang out with people.
But it was just like, the radio, just listening and the wonderful personality that each station had really became a friend.
Yeah. Well, that's very cool. And I think that, just from your love of radio that you bring to what you're doing now, I can see that it's deep and it goes way back.
Yeah. So it really, I can remember as early as, 3rd, 4th grade when they would say, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I would say, "I want to be a radio DJ."
Right. So when was your first job? What was your first job in radio?
I was still living in the Twin Cities area, and I was in high school.
Okay.
And
he was a prodigy, Nick.
Yeah, man.
So I got an internship at a really cool, real progressive alternative station in the 90s called Rev 105, which was, an underdog, smaller signal, cool station that was known for taking, championing new music and left of center music and local and so forth.
Yeah.
So, and by this point, I was way into the alt rock of the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rev 105 had an AM station, KLBB. And it was the songbook, the music of your life.
Right.
It was,
Okay.
the 40s and 50s and even 30s type hits.
Yeah.
But they were getting automation. This is 94, 95. They were getting automation for the overnights. So, and they were going to have it come in by satellite just in the overnights. They were still local during the day. Well, the overnight guy gets wind of this ahead of time and he quits. But the automation equipment isn't there yet. So their program director, Mr. Reed Hagen was his name. He, I just buddied up to him because I was such a radio nerd.
Right.
And so anyway, I remember him saying to the general manager, well, why don't we just let Brad do the overnights till the automation gets here? Because who's listening then anyway?
And how old were you?
So I would have been, I think I was 17. I think I was 17. It was maybe 18, but it was my senior year of high school. So I probably had just turned 18. Yeah. And
so it's quite the vote of confidence.
No
one's listening anyway.
No one's listening anyway, so we need someone in there.
Yeah. That's perfect for you.
Well, and it was great because I was an intern at the other station, the FM station, but not on the air.
Right.
And by doing KLBB, it showed initiative, and fast forward to today. Eventually, I started doing a daytime Sunday show on that station, and it led to a love of that songbook era and the standards and classic pop and, that I use today on the Cruise in the Decades show. I mean, and as that music gets, I just think those 30s, 40s, 50s songs, as they get older, they just get better and better. Like it's a time capsule of historical music. Yeah, so, but that was my first ever radio station was playing the music of your life, or as one of my early mentors said, the music of somebody else's life.
You know what? At this period of time, was that really cool record store still in existence? They had a label too. I wish I could think of the name of it.
Out in Minnesota?
Yeah.
I think no, I don't think so. There was a store called, probably the most famous store at that time was Orfolk Jokopus. Is that the one you're thinking?
It turned into something else. That's why it started. Then they branched out. They had a record label. They had the replacements on.
Yeah. That is what you're thinking of. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So it later became Treehouse Records, I think it was called, towards the end. So my dad used to go to that store even before I was born.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's out near the, what they call the uptown neighborhood of Twin Cities of Minneapolis. And it's kind of like the cool neighborhood near University of Minnesota and all of that. So I mean, there were times that I would, by high school, that I would go to that store with my father and we'd look at, they had, so back then I didn't know all the underground alt rock and indie rock, but they had a basement at that store that was all vintage 45s, obscure, 60s psychedelic. And you could find, it was thousands and thousands of 45s and you could just find anything down there.
Right.
I really, really loved the basement, and then gradually started to get to know, totally obscure 90s alt rock bands and end up shopping more in the upstairs.
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, you discovered that the record by the drummer of the early Jefferson Airplane.
Yes,
that everybody's
Skip Spence.
Everybody's looking for that. You actually found it.
Yeah. I just the more in depth you dive, there's just such amazing music out there. And like, there are certain things like the Doors and Hendrix and Zeppelin that have really transcended the ages, and kids here at Ellett High School are wearing their T-shirts every day, and that's great. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful, but I'm also very interested to dig even deeper to find something a little more obscure that might just blow your mind too. Right.
Is just because this was bugging me, is it's twin tone? Isn't that?
Twin tone.
That's it.
Right. Yeah. Twin tone was the label.
Perubu even had a record on that.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, and that store was integral in Soul Asylum and the Replacements and Husker Du. Those guys
scene.
used to hang out there, and
yeah, because there was like Twin Tone in Minnesota and really in Minneapolis, and then there was. Like SST was Washington bands.
And Clone in Akron.
And Clone in Akron. That's
Can't
right.
forget that, Nick. Hey, speaking of Akron, this is From Akron and Beyond with my co-host Nick Nicholas. This is Bob Ethington, and we are talking with Brad Savage. What is your official title here, actually?
I am the afternoon host and program director of the station. Although since WAPS, the Summit, is technically part of the Akron schools, I have a very unique title that I love.
Okay.
But if you look in the school book, the school board minutia and like the job description, because of the affiliation with this station, it's not, normally you might have a music director or a program director or different radio titles, but I am technically by the school board called a radio specialist.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, that's perfect.
It's really
perfect.
Pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And, Bob and I were talking, months ago about a show we want to have with some local nerd record collectors.
Yeah.
One guy that we know claims to have over 40,000 CDs.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm a piker. I only have 17 or 1,800 and maybe 1,000 albums.
Yeah.
How many do you have? About?
I'm not quite that high, thankfully, but so I really became a hardcore music person during the CD era. I mean, so that's really when the accumulating started. I'm probably around 15,000 CDs, and a good few thousand records and 45s and things like that. But it's funny, because the collecting is bigger than ever again today. Yeah. And I do love vinyl, don't get me wrong, but I tend to be the type looking for unusual CDs and rare CDs and reissues of, the main thing I love collecting is like 90s and early 2000s was when a lot of obscure 30s and 40s music or earlier was coming out on CD. Yeah. And it's so much easier to use them for a radio show if it's on CD.
Sure. Well, there was a period where when CDs first really kind of took over, that everything was coming out on compact disc. Because I also am a lover of classical music, and there were suddenly all of these things that had been long out of print on vinyl that came out, remastered as CDs. Now those are all out of print,
right?
But it was kind of a glory period if you were trying to dig deep into a lot of that kind of music. Going back to your love of sort of the Great American Songbook stuff, it is funny because I kind of grew up with that a bit because that's kind of music that my parents were listening to, and my dad loved music, particularly. And but then I was basically rock and then jazz or what have you. And then at some point, probably when I was turned around 40 or whatever, I suddenly became really interested in Frank Sinatra.
Sure,
and it was like, and it was like because then I'm like, man, there's so many great songs, and of course, Sinatra is one of a kind, but at the same time, he had great taste, right, with what he recorded. And then you go back, from there, it just becomes this huge thing where you're like Hoagie Carmichael, or Bing Crosby, and on and on and on.
You can study by the songwriters, and in that instance, the songs are almost as famous, if not more, than the singers, or as famous in a different way. You know, like, because if you love the song Blue Moon, there's dozens of good recorded versions of those songs, or any of the any of the most famous songs by Cole Porter or whomever, you know,
Gershwin, etc. Well, it was a songwriter's art. It was a song. They were the center of it, and the singer was just sort of the interpreter of that. This person who just sort of, you know. And I remember, for instance, Irving Berlin.
Oh, sure.
He his favorite singer was Fred Astaire, and you'd think kind of like, well, that's odd, because you think of Fred singing in musicals, but you don't think of him as having a great voice. But Irving Berlin said, what I loved about Fred Astaire was he just sings my melodies. He says he's not like, and of course the guy he wouldn't like was Sinatra.
Sure.
He's like, Sinatra's taking it, he's, you know, making it, you know, he's adding all this other stuff. When Fred sings my song, I'm hearing exactly what I wrote. And in a way, those were the guys that had that control at the time. Sinatra would probably be maybe Bing to a degree, but Sinatra then became probably the first guy that really just really was interpreting songs in a way that, you know, made him the focal point. Right.
So when did you get up and leave Minnesota for the next, you know, big radio job?
This was around 2003 or 2004. I was working in radio in the Twin Cities, but I was only doing a weekend show, and it was like
after graduation.
After graduation, I went to school at St. Cloud State University, which is about an hour north of the Twin Cities. And worked in? I did a whole bunch of part-time different radio jobs, filling in. I did the college radio station at KVSC at St. Cloud. It was called. Big influence, and that was great, because that was where I started to really produce my own shows, totally freeform, you know, and luckily, because of the schedule of that station, I could sign up and do a blues show or a jazz show or a deeper classic rock show or whatever. So I really kind of, you know, spread my wings with styles and stuff, learning there, but I could never quite. You know, in a big market like that, they never quite, no one wants to leave radio, and there was never the full-time openings. And I was like, I really wanted to get into being on the radio every day and get into like the programming aspect of it. And so eventually, through various contacts and everything, I was applying to different jobs, and a full-time programming assistant type job and being on air every day in the afternoon came up in, of all places, Columbia, Missouri, Central Missouri, and I loved it. That's a cool college town. That's where Mizzou is down there, University of Missouri. But then when I got there, I realized. It was very funny. We had stations in Columbia and Jefferson City, which is about 30-some miles south. They're kind of a combined metro. And though I was living in Columbia, I had to drive to Jefferson City every day, but that ended up being such a cool adventure, you know, like just going between those two cities and really just engrossing myself in full-time radio and programming. Oh, and this was a station, by the way. This was 100.1 The Buzz, and it was today's rock. So this is like 03, 04. So we were playing all like Godsmack and Stained and Korn, and like the oldies for us were Metallica and Ozzy were the oldies. You know, we didn't go back further than that. But I love a good attitude rock station, even though I'm maybe a little too cheerful for that. I
don't know. Quite angry.
Yes. But and did a couple of years there in Missouri, and then that led to getting a job in Madison, Wisconsin. And I was in Madison for only about a year. And sadly, and that was another kind of rock alternative station. Well, the ratings and the market were not strong enough, so they changed the format to country, and out I went.
Oh, okay.
But I was able to quickly rebound at the time through the same company to a station in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But then there in Ann Arbor, it was an ownership change, so I was only there for about an hour, or about a year, and that led to where I was for just over 9 years, which is Charlottesville, Virginia.
Really?
Okay. And I got to go to Virginia and start up a new station. This was 2006, 2007 that they launched.
Okay.
And I was there for 9 years until moving here to Akron to join the summit, when Mr. Bill Gruber retired.
Now I have to interject here with a couple of comments and questions.
Well,
first of all, Ann Arbor, back in my day and back in Nick's day, that was a very radical place. I don't know what it was. I mean, the radio coming out of Ann Arbor was like MC5, John Sinclair, White Panther Party, all that stuff.
The White Panthers,
Yeah, Ann Arbor, I have to be careful how loudly I say this, but I love that city. That's been a nice... I wish we had even more time to go back, and I still have some friends up there from my time there, and we love visiting, and it's just a cool... It's maybe aged a little bit, you know, and all the young radicals became University of Michigan professors, you know. But no, that's a great city and a ton of good music, and so I worked at a station up there that's still there today, 107.1. It's called Ann Arbor's 107.1, which is a commercial version of adult alternative format we do.
Okay.
So
and this is totally an aside for no particular reason, but I think Ann Arbor had one of the first Borders bookstores.
Oh, they did, in fact.
First.
It was the first.
Really? And I remember going there, and at the time, it was huge. But the thing that was cool about it was not only did they have this incredibly large inventory, but a lot of it was used books as well.
Yeah.
It wasn't just new retail.
Yeah.
There was new retail, but then, so if you went to for instance, I was interested in philosophy. And you could find things there that you'd never find anywhere else. I mean, it was an amazing bookstore.
So when I was there, we were doing. They also had at the time a large music section. And it was CDs in this. Because I was there in 04, 05. Yeah, 04, 05, 06, somewhere in that era, and we would do live bands at Borders Books in the store that we would pick up and carry live on the radio station. So it's like what we do here with Studio C, but it was from the middle of Borders. And I remember doing one where I interviewed the band Hoobastank live on the air in Ann Arbor. Yeah, because I only did a couple of them that I was hosting, because at that point I was programming director, but I took a backseat role as far as on air. We let Martin Bandyke, our ace morning show host, do all of those, but a few of them I did. I also, who else did I interview Duncan Sheik there at one point, but Ann Arbor's a cool vibe, and we could do a whole show about the bookstore world, but that Borders was huge.
I remember just being, it was like heaven to me. I was just ecstatic about it. So now Charlottesville, is that Navy country? Is that
no? So that's more like the Norfolk, Virginia Beach areas. So Charlottesville is a cool, funky little college town in the foothills of Blue Ridge Mountains, and it's where Thomas Jefferson Monticello is there.
Okay,
and the Dave Matthews Band hails from Charlottesville too. But University of Virginia is really one of the main things that was, that city is famous for, and we think back very fondly on it. It's a cool college town city. It's gotten very expensive, as you might expect. A lot of good bands, though, a good music scene, but also their geography-wise, it was limited because the mountains and all this other terrain comes in. So it was not. it definitely didn't grow much larger, and it started to feel like just very crowded, you know. They kind of have, we've sort of talked about this on some of the other shows about Akron, but they kind of have this mentality of, we're full, don't move here. You know, that type of thing.
Right. Yeah, I totally know where that is now. I was confusing it a little bit. University of Virginia, talk about a totally random aside, but one of my very favorite bands is Pavement.
Oh, yes, right.
And
Pavement.
those guys had a connection there. And I think David Berman, who with the Silver Jews, and was a poet, also was there, right?
Yes, and many of these guys worked at WTJU, the college radio station.
I was going to say, I thought that they did have radio.
And not Chuck Klosterman, who you would also know, but who's the other guy that wrote Love is a Mixtape, and he wrote for Rolling, or he still does.
Rob Sheffield.
Yeah, Rob Sheffield.
I'm friends with him.
Oh, you know him too? Of course. Yeah.
Via Chuck, actually.
Okay. Rob Sheffield has ties there, and it's a good music and history type of city. Sissy Spacek lives there and is from there, and
beautiful part of the country.
It's and it was just warmer enough that you know, it was wild to me, having grown up in Minnesota. If 2 or 3 inches of snow would come, they'd cancel school the night before the snow even started. You know, we're not going to deal with this.
Right.
You know?
So after 9 years there, then your next job was here?
Yeah. We, I was really interested. By then, I had a 2-year-old son, David, and our younger son, Simon, was on the way. And, you know, radio keeps getting more and more volatile, you know? You just don't know. There's more cutbacks, and you don't know what to expect. And I was aware, I had met Bill Gruber at some radio industry conferences, and knew of the Summit, WAPS, and knew that Bill was going to retire. I also knew Liz Mazzacco, now Liz Felix, who was the music director and midday host at the time here at the Summit, too.
Okay, I know Liz.
And today she's in Pittsburgh at station WYEP. So everyone keeps bouncing around, it seems. But I really wanted to get into the public radio side of things because of even more creative freedom to build different shows and to really, musically be a little more challenging.
Maybe a little more stability too.
Well, and that was the other thing was Bill went to Kent, worked here at the Summit for 30 years and retired. And he worked at this one station, and that was it. So I was like, well, I have to really screw it up to get bounced out of there. so I was
this is really interesting because it's like by coming here to the Summit, you have simultaneously found a more sort of secure job, and yet a much more free and liberating programming thing that you can do, which is like the perfect combination.
That's like winning the lottery on that.
Because usually you think if you're doing the more liberated programming, not radical, but you know what I mean, free form kind of programming, that you're more, walking the tight wire in terms of employment, know?
For sure. Those are the types of stations that run into financial troubles and signal limitations or get sold or whatever. But, luckily, knock on wood, we have built the Summit into a pretty good self-sustaining type of station here. And, and it was nice because I came in, and as Gruber was retiring, I was able to actually add a lot more deeper tracks and music to the library. It just seemed like the right thing to do at that point.
Right.
And now, now the Summit is very much on par with other all music public radio stations around the country, and other markets like Milwaukee or Louisville or other cool medium sized markets. And there aren't we always like to point out, especially during Pledge Drive, there aren't many stations like this.
No.
I mean, out of, I believe it's somewhere around 11,000 licensed radio stations in the USA. And of that, a couple thousand of those are public radio listener supported. But within that, there's fewer than 100 stations doing adult alternative music, progressive music, whatever, that aren't, part of NPR or like running news talk type program, that are just independent music stations. It's probably closer to 50, actually,
really?
Out of all of those stations. So there aren't that many out there, and it just takes the right type of city and right type of audience.
Yeah.
Right type of staff, too.
And the right type of staff, yes.
But I'm sure that we're biased, but I mean, I'm just, something about the Summit that I love, and we've talked about this numerous times over various episodes of our program, which is From Akron and Beyond. And I'm Bob Ethington with Nick Nicholas, my co-host. But talking about radio, it's so nice with the Summit that you can get in your car and you can drive for 20 minutes. You don't know what you're going to hear.
Yeah, sure.
And even the stations, which some names have been, some call numbers have come up in a conversation, but I won't name any of them. People who know who they are, they're the big stations in town. They play the same thing over and over. And sometimes it's even like, okay, you're going to play classic album rock. That's fine. Do you always have to play the same song off of those albums?
Right.
Who's Next or Exile on Main Street? They have a whole lot of songs that are really good, but they always play the same one or two.
It's come down
it's so tiresome.
Yeah, it's come down to the safest, widest overall.
Yeah.
Like a lot of that is researched. There are like research companies that do testing to figure out which the biggest songs. But and it is a shame that AC/DC and Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin have been distilled down to 5 or 6 songs, when most of the people that really love that music know all those albums, especially that era, the early era of those careers. Luckily for us, we aren't really bound by those same type of restrictions. That's a big part of my job, is to balance that line of being familiar enough to draw an audience and not being entirely freeform, that it's too left of center, but also being left of center and interesting and edgy enough that I love it when people say, you just never know what you're going to hear. There's a lot of surprises there. That's the sweet spot for this type of station anyway.
Exactly. And I think that's terrific because, first of all, to what we're talking about with the stations that are so formatted, to me, that's marketing run amok. That's like it's ultimately self-defeating, I think, because you just can't keep listening to that all the time because you're hearing the same music all the time.
And even people like me that know a little bit of pop music, I heard something for the first time last year. I went out and bought it, the new John Doe that you were playing.
Yeah, sure.
Where are you going to hear that locally?
Right.
Yeah, we're very proud to continue that catalog, both backwards and forwards, with new material and deeper, older material.
Right.
And that's why it's so perfect for a music nut like me, to be able to do that. And I think the problem that commercial radio in general got into was the music became secondary to selling commercials.
Yeah,
and what they were focused on was getting the largest audience to hear the commercials.
Right.
But there's a delicate art versus commerce balance somewhere in there.
Right.
And I think radio a number of years ago now took that too far and went just too safe. You know, and I'm not saying that they should be playing 40 minutes of Jethro Tull Thick as a Brick at 7 a.m. on a weekday. But I think they could make a special show to go deeper into, you know, I mean, because think about the glory around here, the way people loved WMMS back in the day and like the affinity for that. And in many ways, our music, at least a good portion of our music is different, but we're kind of trying to follow that same ethos on the Summit, you know, like we're a modern equivalent to a fairly eclectic, you know, playing a lot of local music and new band, taking chances and breaking new bands and bringing them to town for events and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, you know, and the one other thing I'd mention about this too is that even with like, you know, like satellite radio or whatever, a lot of, so, you know, you tune into that and you're listening to, say, a Springsteen station or whatever. Well, you know what you're going to hear. You're going to hear Springsteen. And maybe, you know, a couple things that influenced him or something. But on the Summit, you really never know. And that to me is
it's the beauty of it.
Yeah, it is. It's a beautiful thing. It really is. So anyway, we sure are praising Brad a lot.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, man.
And let me say, that's not all me by any means. That's the whole team and our quirky cast of characters that makes the radio station what it is.
You mentioned you're a program director, right?
Yes.
And there's a music director.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Well, good question. So Chad Miller, our midday host, also serves as music director, and he, you know, Chad and I are a good yin and yang as far as new music too, because he favors a lot of the new indie and like really cool labels and like breaking artists and you know and I like a lot of that too, but his personal taste is different. My personal taste tends to be a little more catchy hooks, you know, and leaning mainstream. Like, I love finding an artist that's just about to break big and then championing that artist. Like Noah Kahn is a great example, or Mitski, you know, those are probably in the last 12 months big examples of breaking stories. But it's also funny when you look at Chad and me together. He is a lyrics listener, right? Like he loves to zero in on the words when he hears a song. And I tend to listen to the beat, the hook, the melody, you know, like the lyrics kind of come after I've heard it a few times is when I pay attention. But I think that manages to balance nicely too.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about a show that I know you're very proud of, which is Cruising the Decades.
Oh, it's a great show.
And so tell us about that. Like, how did that even get started?
Well,
I know that we've talked about your love of the older music.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I had done an early version of that show in St. Cloud, Minnesota, at KVSC, my college station.
It goes that far back.
It goes that far back, and that was just an excuse because that station had a lot of freeform shows where you could just do whatever. Yeah. And at that time, I was like, well, we don't really play the songbook on this station, and I'm going to invent a show where we can play some of that, but keep it current. So the concept of Cruising the Decades is we start 100 years ago and pick one song per decade, and it could be any or all genres.
So cool.
But it's generally popular music, but it's popular recordings from 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, up to 2000s and 2010s and 2020s. Well, I had all but forgotten about that concept until the pandemic weirdness of 2020 came around. And it really started with one of those late insomnia nights when I was digging through my music basement and I was, you know, and I had been reading about the previous pandemic of the 1910s, you know, the Spanish flu pandemic. And I was like, you know what? I have some really old 1910s record, you know, CDs somewhere. I'm going to dig those up. What were they singing about? What did popular music sound like back during that first pandemic?
Yeah.
And I just dug it out and started listening and thought, and at that point, no one was working here. So I didn't even ask any permission. We were taking turns during the pandemic. Like, I would come in and Chad would leave, and like Andrew might be here till Chad got here, and like we were all doing remote. It was just the on-air team was coming each day. So I didn't really ask permission. I just brought back Cruising the Decades once in 2020 on the summit, and luckily, after the initial, like, wow, that's wild that they're playing 30s and 40s songs on the summit, because we didn't really do that even prior to that show coming on. It got good response. It got really good response. And kind of became a Friday staple. And then a couple of years later, in 2022, in winter of 2022, January, I got connected to shortwave radio, WRMI, which is in Radio Miami International, shortwave. One of my radio nerd friends said, you should give shortwave your Cruise in the Decades show. They are looking for independent programmers and out there ideas.
Is that just like a gimmick title, or is there really a shortwave radio?
No, there really is. Like, so do you remember like my parents had like listened to shortwave a lot in the 60s?
That's what I'm asking.
So yes, many, but not all, but many of the stations nowadays are religious formats on there. I hadn't really listened to shortwave in a long time, but there are a couple of these left of center renegade shortwave radio broadcasters that take independent programming and try and like reach out with something very different than what might be found. And there are hobbyists and like a lot of ham radio people like to listen to the shortwave broadcasts. And if anyone is not familiar with shortwave, they're like super high powered stations, and then the wavelength of the signal is such that they cover hundreds, thousands of miles across borders, and go all over. So I was thrilled to put the concept of Cruising the Decades on one of these shortwave stations, because even though they transmit down near Okeechobee, Florida, near Miami, we were I very quickly started getting emails and correspondence from people in Canada and Europe and, in Boise, Idaho and in Montana. And it's not, there's not a lot of people listening, but there are like enthusiasts to it,
So they're into it. I hadn't thought of this in years, but talking about shortwave radio, when I was a kid, I got for Christmas like a 5-band radio.
Oh, sure.
Remember those?
Yeah.
And it had a shortwave, was one of the bands. And I used to listen to that. Oh, this would have been when I was probably, 14, 15 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
And I'd listen real late at night to the shortwave. And what I was intrigued by at the time was that you'd get these stations that were like Russian, like Soviet Union propaganda stations. And so it would be like and so now it's, whatever time, now it's time for the news. And then it would be like, once again, the United States continues their colonialist policies. As they, and it was just, I was fascinated by that.
Well, what's amazing is shortwave came back in the news with the Ukraine invasion by Russia, and then some European and even some of the frequencies in Miami have been transmitting the exact opposite. Trying to transmit the news into Russia that is being blocked by government forces, and that's part of what I just love about radio, and especially long distance like that is it's kind of like the internet before the internet, carrying left of center ideas afar in a less obvious manner,
So you remember Radio Free Europe? That was a shortwave.
So that was the first station that subscribe to your program?
Right. Well, at that point, I just started doing a version for Radio Miami International. I just started producing what I called the Cruise in the Decades Global Edition. And I produced it right here at the summit.
Okay,
and I would just send it to them through like a FTP download.
Okay.
And then we found an airtime. Well, I started posting about it on my social media and telling my radio nerd friends and strong-arming certain people. And eventually, a number of other radio stations started picking up that same show, same Cruise in the Decades. Yeah. But it was very organic. And we still have not found a way to make any money off of it or put a sponsor in. But I don't even care. I'm not doing it for that. I just want to pick the songs for an hour on any station that'll welcome such a concept.
It's a really cool show.
Sure,
I mean, the whole idea is really interesting. The way you do it is really well done.
And I think
it's fun.
It ties a lot of personal things together because it goes back to my first station and the love of the songbook.
Yes,
like as that music gets older and older, there are so few of those standard stations left anyway. Because it used to be oldies stations played 50s and 60s. Well, now the oldies stations play 70s and 80s. It's like so anyway, it's a way to like honor all of that pre-rock and roll era music. And it kind of honors my grandparents and the music they listened to.
Sure.
And then my upbringing as a record collector, because I'm always now thinking, I have to buy this record. I need to play it on Cruise in the Decades.
Right.
This expensive, obscure such and so thing.
So you're feeding the beast.
That's right.
You were talking about different genres of radio. Are there any polka stations still around?
There are a few polka shows.
Yeah.
In northern Minnesota, there was, I don't think it's all polka anymore, but there was until late 90s. There were at least a couple. And there's, Youngstown has a couple polka shows on AM that come on Sundays and stuff. I think it's fascinating. I love that.
The Cleveland NPR station used to have a polka show on Saturday or Sunday night.
I think WZIP here at University of Akron still runs a Saturday morning polka too.
I remember my parents used to listen to the Greek program on Sundays at Akron News radio station.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a place for all of that, and I think with all the technology that radio today is facing and put up against, doing something really uniquely local like that and really special and setting your watch by, I have to tune in to hear that now. That's going to be the future for radio broadcasting.
Thursdays at 10 o'clock.
Yeah. Thursdays at 10 o'clock right here on the summit.
But, it's an interesting thing because of all the different formats of media, probably none has been quote unquote dying longer than radio. Right? I mean, people have acted like radio is going to be obsolete for decades. When TV came and then when just on the internet and everything. And
now it's newspapers, but radio's been dying a slow death for like 50 years.
The thing is newspapers are in trouble. Yeah. Radio seems as strong as ever to me and I've never understood it because when people talk about what the alternative to radio is, the alternative is basically radio.
Right.
I mean, podcast or radio.
Or basically radio.
Yeah, just a different way that you get it, you know?
Yep.
And so it just, there is always going to be, I think, a place for just having something you listen to and that is being well programmed and coordinated and put together. So you can just kind of take that in as you will, and passively or more actively.
Always an alternative.
And as long as people are moving around in vehicles, there's always going to be a role for radio.
I would say the biggest selling point for what we do and stations like the Summit today are that curation, that hosting and that like discovery element where you listen to our show and our team to find something that you probably wouldn't find on your own, or it would take, or people are busy with lives and family and jobs and stuff. So if the Summit is doing our job correctly, Chad and I and the whole team are finding the best new bands, local or international or whatever. Yeah. And then I think, the other part of what radio's strong suit is that the shared moment, that everyone's listening to the same thing. We only get to pick one song at a time, and you don't get to skip like you do. So there's an investment of attention span. Right. But I think there's a reward when you invest that time. Right. And in a 10-second attention span society, not everyone is willing to invest that time anymore. Right. But there's reward when you discover something great. Yeah. Yeah.
Turn it on, man.
I was thinking about this last week for some reason. I don't know why, but it came to me about, remember, of course, we all remember the tragic events of 9/11, but then remember about 2 years after that, 2003, there was a huge blackout.
Yes.
Which, apparently First Energy had something involved with.
Yeah, the trees fell.
Trees fell, and it knocked out the
East Coast.
Of the country. Yeah. But, it was funny because I was working at the library. The main library at that time was at a temporary site that was on Talbot Avenue. So I got off work at 5, got onto the expressway, was driving home, got off the expressway, and all of a sudden all the street lights and every light was out. It happened literally in that time that I was driving home. And the first thing I did was turn on the radio on my car to see what they were saying, and there was no radio.
Right.
And that to this day is one of the things I think most freaked me out. I'm like, because I thought for sure we were being invaded again.
Right. It was crazy.
Yeah.
You know what?
Which again, my point here of the story is that was something I was relying on.
Right.
And sure enough, the radio was the first thing that came back.
A
couple of stations were the one, like WAKR.
Yeah, I had no power at home.
Came back on about an hour later, and it was strange. But they,
I went outside and started my car up and turned the radio on. That's how I found out what was going on. Well, you guys have done so much more. Like the Alan Cross show.
Right.
I mean, it's not just music. You brought stuff here that people tune in every week just to see what the latest show is,
Hopefully so. I was always taught that the best radio stations are a town hall of your community, a gathering spot where you kind of find out what's happening and what's cool this week or what's next.
I know you've told this story a lot when you retell it during the broadcast of his show, but some of the people that aren't familiar with that, just explain it, because that's something that came up through you.
So each weeknight at 9 for a few years now, we've run the Alan Cross show, Ongoing History of New Music, and he is pretty well known in Canada, but for whatever reason, they've had syndication deals that have fallen through and so forth. He never was able to capture a U.S. audience and U.S. syndication with that program. Well, I happened to hear it on a trip to Toronto years ago when we lived in Ann Arbor, and I started stalking him on the internet and followed that show, and then eventually. I was at a radio industry conference down in Nashville, pre-pandemic, and he was at a dinner at one of the restaurants, and I accosted him. I need to take pictures with you. I love your show, and emailed him. And then finally, he then hooked me up with. I started emailing him. We want to run your show, and I know we're a public radio station. We're part of a high school. It's educational. Right. So he was like. Eventually, they they were like, let's make this guy go away and just let him download the show and play it on his station. And so that's kind of how we started with that. And, he started that program in early 90s in Canada. Yeah. But it's interesting, when he came here for that event, he said it started as a radio show for syndication, but now it's more like a podcast that happens to have some radio stations that broadcast it, but their largest audience is online. Right. The problem is they can't play the whole songs. He does music biography and deep music history, but they can only play much like the podcast version of this show. Right, we have to edit out the songs due to copyright issues. But yeah, it's those are the special moments of curation that make the brand of what the Summit FM is so special and so unique to this area.
Yeah. So this has been From Akron and Beyond, and we've been talking with Brad Savage, our producer of our show, and also the guy who is the program director and afternoon host here at the Summit. So most of you have heard his voice many times, but we're kind of gotten a little deeper. And we're starting to run out of time here, but I do have one more question for you, which is that anyone who is around Brad, I think, will agree about one thing, which is that you are an incredibly enthusiastic guy, and it comes to you very natural. It's not fake in the least. But the thing is that you also seem, almost to a fault, to love all music.
Yes.
I have yet to hear like a band that you just like, oh, those guys stink. And I have like a whole list of that. But I don't want to hear about who stinks. But what I want to hear from you before we end the episode is, push comes to shove, tell us your 1, 2, maybe 3 absolute favorite artists.
That's going to be 6 hours of this after the show.
Yeah, I know. Whoever I pick here, we're going to do a jamboree.
See you next week.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
Yeah, I really do love so many styles, but when it comes...
And it could be anything, any kind of genre, music, whatever.
I mean, when it comes down to it, it's probably the early alternative and modern rock era, new wave and things like that are my biggest influences. So I would say I'm probably going to go with... the Ramones and Tom Petty and REM are probably my all-time top 3.
Well, that's
I know somebody that you like that a lot of people don't even know who they are. Material Issue.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's my glory days in high school. Like, I was listening to Material Issue, Ned's Atomic Dustbin, and what was modern rock or alternative right before Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and the grunge sound came in. So bands like Soup Dragons, and that's where the Summit comes from. That's what we played back, and like the New Order era and the B-52s and all that era. That's what this station's heritage is, the Cure, bands like that. Right. So that's kind of my number one golden era, but I can even appreciate Nickelback and Creed, and it's not cool to like those groups,
That's great.
Well, as I said, Brad loves everything, but he really does. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really, I think, enlightening to
a lot of fun too,
Nick and I, and I hope to the audience as well. And so, Brad, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, guys. This was great.
Okay, you bet. And we'll see everyone next time.
Next time.